So at this point, you got a solid sense of how the web and the web's technology took a hard left from a tool built for researchers and academics to a commercial platform used by businesses and everyday people. And with that shift, the W3C had to play catch up, recognizing that the public wanted a visual web, not just a document sharing system. So as we talked about before, somewhat ironically, it was the very companies pushing the limits with styling and layout in web pages, namely Microsoft and Netscape, that ended up helping the W3C move forward with the visual web. So both companies updated their web browsers to support the new CSS1 specification. And once they did, the other browsers like Opera and Apple Safari, which came a bit later, followed their lead because Microsoft and Netscape adopted something, everyone else followed suit. Now, just to anchor us in time, this was the mid-1990s, and Netscape Navigator with its Gecko engine did a pretty decent job of interpreting the CSS1 spec. But Internet Explorer, powered by Microsoft's Trident engine, was a totally different story. Because back in lecture 6, I talked about how Microsoft's dominance may have given them a sense of entitlement, like they didn't have to follow the specs too closely. And honestly, that's kind of how it felt. So as a developer at the time, you could write your CSS exactly how the W3C said it would work and still find that Internet Explorer rendered things, pretty much unpredictably, where sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. That was just the reality of working with the web in those days. So how did all this work in reality? The W3C's working groups, made up of representatives from companies like Microsoft and Netscape and others, would meet to define how things should work and what properties should exist, what values they could take, and how browsers should interpret them. That is, how they should be displayed in users' viewports. So then after a lot of discussion and revision, the working group would publish a recommendation, in this case, the CSS1 spec, and then, this is the key part, it would be up to the browser vendors, in other words, the engineers working on the rendering engines like Trident from Microsoft and Gecko from Netscape, to follow the recommendation and add those capabilities to their web browsers. And then pretty much in parallel, the W3C and industry advocates would present new standards at conferences, write about them in trade magazines, and spread the word through online communities. And eventually, we developers would start using CSS in the real world, building websites with these new styling tools. Over time, that helped move us away from the workarounds and hacks that we had relied on back before we had to bend HTML to do things that it was never meant to do. So before CSS, we relied on a mix of non-standard tags, misused attributes, and table-based layouts just to make web pages look like product brochures. But with CSS, we finally had a better way, a dedicated presentation layer that let us control styling cleanly and consistently without polluting the structure of the content. So, right there and then, that was a huge step forward because it was supportable, updatable, and most importantly, sustainable. So at this point, between our lecture videos and our class discussions and assignments that you're doing in class, you should be able to get a handle of how the web works at this lowest level and how to create and publish basic web pages on the internet yourself. But there's still something missing, something you have come to expect as a user of today's web. And I'm not talking about full-blown web applications like social media platforms or e-commerce, because we'll talk about that later, but those go beyond the scope of this course. So what I mean is something much simpler that we need to cover, a way to make your pages do things, to react, to move, and to interact with the user in real time. So far in class, we've been creating what we call in the industry static web pages. But in the industry, there's a third layer called behavior. And for the web, we've got another language for that, and it's called JavaScript. So just as a quick aside, Around here at RIT, you might hear people refer to something called DHTML. And just to be clear, that's not a thing, because DHTML was a marketing term used in the late 1990s and early 2000s to describe kind of a combination of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript used to create interactive web pages. Things like drop-down menus and menu rollovers, or expanding content and sections. Expanding content sections, which is like what we call accordions. They were all called DHTML. So yeah, DHTML is a bit of a misnomer. It implies that there's some new kind of distinct technology like HTML with special dynamic capabilities. But in reality, it's just a label that companies like Microsoft and Netscape use to promote this new kind of web experience. And these days, we just call it client-side scripting or DOM manipulation. And we'll talk about DOM, which stands for Document Object Model, in just a minute. But the idea of a dynamic web page is what's missing. So we'll start working on that in class. But before that, and this is my style, that I want you to understand how we got here and how and why JavaScript came to be. And that might help you better understand what it can do, what it can't do, and most importantly, why it is the way it is.